The Bancroft family was one of America's most discreet yet most powerful media dynasties. Their power came from 105 years of controlling the Wall Street Journal, the most prestigious financial newspaper in the world. This control was not established by a Bancroft. It was started by their progenitor, Clarence W. Barron, who purchased Dow Jones and Company back in 1902 and built it into a global financial news empire. For 3 generations, the Bancrofts shaped financial journalism. They did this primarily through their passive ownership of the company's key assets, including the Journal and Barron's magazine. Their power was preserved through a complex system of family trusts. By 2007, this system gave them 64% of the company's voting rights. But despite a century of hands-off stewardship, the family's history is ultimately defined by that deep internal passivity. It was a passivity that ended in a bitter public controversy and the 2007 sale of their entire empire to Rupert Murdoch. Who really built the Wall Street Journal? The Bancroft dynasty is a fabrication. The name itself, which for a century held sway over the most important financial publication in the world, was a historical footnote, the result of a marriage. The family never built the Wall Street Journal. They did not forge it, conceptualize it, or bleed for it. They were not entrepreneurs. They were, from the very beginning, beneficiaries. The empire they controlled was the creation of another man, a figure so dominant and brilliant that his shadow would dictate the family's fate for a century after his death. That man was Clarence W. Barron. There is no Bancroft dynasty without him. He was the true patriarch. Born in 1855, Barron was the father of modern financial journalism. He was a force of nature, a physical and intellectual giant. Weighing over 300 pounds, he was a man of colossal appetites for food, for information, and for work. He was described by contemporaries as a human sponge, tireless, obsessive, and possessed of a frighteningly sharp intellect. While other journalists of the Gilded Age were content to reprint press releases from J.P. Morgan or parrot the rumors of the stock exchange, Barron invented a new method. He believed that numbers on a ticker tape were a symptom, not a story. The real story was in the motive. He pioneered investigative financial reporting. He did not just sit at a desk, he walked factory floors. He buttonholed railroad magnates on their private cars. He interrogated bankers, not as a stenographer, but as a prosecutor. His creed was simple: I am a detective. He believed that every balance sheet was a confession, and it was his job to find the crime, or at all costs, the truth. His Barron's column became a sensation in Boston, a must-read for anyone who wanted to understand why a stock was moving, not just that it was moving. In 1902, he saw his opportunity. A small, struggling New York news service named Dow Jones and Company was for sale. It had been founded in 1889 by Charles Dow, Edward Jones, and Charles Bergstresser, and it published a thin, small circulation afternoon paper called the Wall Street Journal. The company was on the verge of failure. Barron, however, saw what no one else did. He saw that the 20th century would be defined by capital, and the men who controlled that capital needed a Bible. He bought the company for $130,000. He immediately poured his ferocious energy into the journal. He expanded its scope, its depth, and its ambition. He demanded that his reporters adopt his detective methods. He insisted on accuracy, fairness, and, above all, courage. He famously posted a sign in the newsroom: "The Journal is a newspaper of character. It does not bow to advertisers. It does not bow to the men of Wall Street." Under his leadership, the paper became the indispensable record of American capitalism, a pillar of the financial establishment that was also, paradoxically, its most feared critic. But Barron's genius in the newsroom was matched by a void in his personal life. He had married Jessie M. Barron, and with her came a daughter from her previous marriage, Jane. Clarence Barron had no children of his own. He was a creator with no blood heir. This biological fact is the pivot upon which the entire Bancroft dynasty turns. He adored his stepdaughter, Jane, and her sister, but he recognized that they did not share his obsessive passion for the business. His solution was to entrust the future of his creation not to a person, but to a structure. He began to devise a system of trust that would preserve the institution long after he was gone. Jane, the stepdaughter, grew up in this rarefied world of Boston wealth and journalistic power. In 1900, she married Hugh Bancroft, a Boston lawyer. It was this marriage that brought the Bancroft name into the Dow Jones story. When Clarence Barron died in 1928, his massive estate, including the controlling interest in Dow Jones, passed to his stepdaughter, Jane. The control was not liquid. It was locked in trust. The pressure of this succession, this impossible burden of replacing a legend, fell on Jane's husband, Hugh Bancroft Sr. He was a capable man, a lawyer, but he was not Clarence Barron. He was not a journalist, nor was he an obsessive detective. He was a Bostonian administrator, tasked with steering a financial newspaper through the greatest financial collapse in human history. The stock market crashed in 1929, 1 year after Barron's death. The Great Depression began. The pressure on Hugh Bancroft Sr. was unimaginable. He was navigating a company whose entire readership was facing ruin, all while trying to emerge from the shadow of his colossal father-in-law. The company's finances teetered. The family's wealth evaporated. The psychological toll was too much. In 1933, Hugh Bancroft Sr. died by suicide. This second tragedy, Barron's death followed by his successor's suicide, became the defining trauma of the Bancroft family. It cemented a fatal ideology deep within the family's matriarch, Jane. The business, she concluded, was a killer. It was a burden so heavy it had broken her husband. It was a responsibility that, if passed directly, would destroy her children as well. Her solution was an act of maternal protection that would, a century later, be seen as an act of catastrophic negligence. She decided to protect her children from the business. She would save them from the burden of leadership. With her lawyers, she reinforced and expanded the trust structure. The family's 60 to 70% voting control, held in super voting Class B shares, was locked away. Her children, Hugh Jr., Jessie, and another Jane, would not be owners. They would be beneficiaries. This is the most critical distinction in the Bancroft story. They were not taught to be publishers. They were not trained as editors. They were not apprenticed at the factory as a Hershey was, or taught to read a balance sheet as a Rockefeller was. They were taught, quite simply, to cash the checks. The trusts were designed to provide a river of passive, effortless income generation after generation, while the power of their 64% vote would be held by fiduciaries and family-appointed lawyers. The goal was to ensure the family could never lose the company, but it also ensured they would never know how to run it. This legal and financial cage created the culture that would ultimately doom them. The subsequent generations of Bancrofts were raised in a world of profound cognitive dissonance. They were, on paper, one of the most powerful families in American media, but in practice, they were utterly removed from the source of their power. They lived in wealthy, insular enclaves in Boston, in Denver, and on Cape Cod. They embraced the family tradition of hiding. They were phantoms in their own company. It was said that many Dow Jones executives had never once met a member of the Bancroft family, even as those same family members held the power of life and death over their careers. This invisibility was a point of pride, a mark of their Boston Brahmin disdain for the showy publicity of New York's new money clans. But it was a corrosive invisibility. As the generations splintered, the trusts spread the wealth thinner and thinner. By the 2000s, there were 35 family members with a claim on the dividends. Vanity Fair magazine later estimated that this group collectively received $20 to $30 million per year from Dow Jones dividends alone. This guaranteed unearned income, divorced from any responsibility, created the exact stereotype they could never escape: the lazy, entitled trust fund baby. The family became known for its eccentricities, not its accomplishments. They were horse breeders, gardeners, and amateur pilots. They were not businessmen. And as reports from inside the family later revealed, this culture of entitlement had a darker side. Rumors of alcoholism and sheer incompetence plagued certain branches of the family. One prominent descendant in particular would later become the public symbol of this disconnect, a figure who, according to scathing reports, was completely removed from the journalistic mission of the Journal. This individual, living a life of luxury in a multi-million-dollar California home, was portrayed as being far more concerned with the declining stock price than the paper's integrity. This type of beneficiary, whether the reports were entirely fair or not, highlighted the fatal flaw in Jane Bancroft's protective structure. She had successfully saved her children from the burden of the company, but she had also robbed them of the competence to defend it. She had created a dynasty of passive recipients. They had all of the power, but none of the knowledge. They were kings and queens who had never been taught how to rule, how to fight, or even how to recognize an enemy when he arrived at the castle gates. This combination of absolute power and profound personal incompetence was the fatal flaw, the genetic time bomb planted at the family's creation, just waiting for the right predator to trigger it. The owners ignored the internet, and the company nearly failed. While the Bancroft family hid, their newspaper conquered the world. The story of Dow Jones in the 20th century is one of the greatest successes in media history, but it is a success that happened in spite of its owners, not because of them. The family provided the one thing they were capable of: stability. They were the absentee monarchs, and in their absence, a regency of brilliant professional journalists built an empire in their name. The central figure in this rise was not a Bancroft. He was Barney Kilgore. Kilgore, a Midwesterner who took the helm of the Journal in the 1940s, was the true heir to Clarence Barron's genius. He looked at the Journal, then still a dry, dense, New York-centric financial sheet, and envisioned something revolutionary. He wanted to make business the most compelling story in America. He is credited with creating the modern front page of the Wall Street Journal, a format that would become the most imitated in the world. He introduced the What's News column, a perfect two-column summary of the world's most important events, and the Leaders, the long-form, deeply reported stories on topics no one else was covering. Kilgore's philosophy was simple: tell the why. He forced his reporters to explain why a steel tariff in Washington mattered to a corn farmer in Iowa, or why a new invention in a California garage would change the way New Yorkers lived. He broadened the paper's definition of business to include everything: politics, culture, science, and social trends. He was, in essence, creating the first truly national newspaper, decades before USA Today. The Bancroft family, ensconced in their Boston trusts, largely left him alone. They were content to cash the dividend checks, which, thanks to Kilgore's revolution, grew larger every year. The Journal's circulation, which was a mere 50,000 in 1902 and had stagnated during the Depression, began an inexorable climb. It passed 100,000, then 500,000, then 1 million. By 2007, on the eve of its sale, the Wall Street Journal had a daily print circulation of 2.1 million. This was a staggering achievement. It had become the largest newspaper in the United States, surpassing its great rival, the New York Times, in daily readership. It wasn't just big, it was the most powerful paper. The Journal's editorial page became the unofficial doctrine of American capitalism, a must-read for presidents, CEOs, and Federal Reserve chairs. Its newsroom became a fortress of journalistic integrity, accumulating Pulitzer Prizes for its fearless reporting. The Journal was the paper that broke the Enron scandal. It was the paper that uncovered corporate malfeasance and held Wall Street accountable, just as Clarence Barron had intended. And at the heart of its power was the Dow Jones Industrial Average. First published in 1896, this simple average of blue-chip stocks became more than a metric. It became a global psychological benchmark. The Dow, as it was known, was the daily heartbeat of the market. Its rise and fall was the lead story on every evening news broadcast. It was the tool by which ordinary people measured the health of their economy and their own wealth. The Bancrofts didn't just own a newspaper, they owned the scorecard of capitalism. This dominance, however, masked a deep and fatal rot. The family's strategy, if it could be called that, was one of profound, terrified conservatism. The trauma of the 1933 suicide and the Great Depression had been seared into the family's DNA. Their prime directive was not to innovate, it was to preserve. Their goal was not to conquer new worlds, but to never ever lose the one they had. They clung to the high-margin, predictable business of print. This strategy was enshrined in the company's very structure. The family's 64% voting control was held in a special class of super-voting Class B shares. This structure was a fortress, designed by their ancestors to make a hostile takeover mathematically impossible. No raider could ever acquire enough votes to challenge the family's wishes. But the fortress had become a prison. It insulated the family from the market, but it also insulated them from reality. This created a fatal culture of inertia. The non-family executives who actually ran the company, like CEO Peter Cann and his successor Richard Zannino, were in an impossible position. They could not make bold, risky, or transformative moves, the very kind needed to combat the rise of Bloomberg, because any such move threatened the family's sacred cow, the quarterly dividend. The Bancrofts, as passive beneficiaries, were not interested in long-term capital investments. They were interested in the immediate, predictable income that funded their lifestyles. This forced management to adopt a strategy of slow managed decline. The problem was personified by the family members who actually sat on the board. They were not chosen for their business acumen or digital expertise. They were chosen based on which branch of the family was next in line. They were amateurs in a game of sharks, tasked with overseeing a multi-billion-dollar media company while possessing no relevant experience at all. As the 1980s and 1990s dawned, the world of information was changing. The digital revolution had begun, and the Bancrofts, critics charged, were asleep. As Forbes magazine would note in a scathing 2006 analysis, the family was guilty of a crippling inertia. While other media companies were frantically investing in cable television, satellite networks, and the burgeoning internet, Dow Jones did almost nothing. The family, critics argued, was too comfortable. The dividends from the print newspaper were still so enormous that they saw no reason to risk that income on unproven low-margin ventures like dot-coms. They were guardians, not visionaries. They saw their role as protecting the past, not building the future. This failure of imagination created a vacuum, and a new, more ruthless competitor stepped in to fill it. That competitor was Michael Bloomberg. Bloomberg, a former trader, saw the future with the clarity the Bancrofts lacked. He understood that financial professionals didn't just want a newspaper delivered in the afternoon. They wanted data delivered instantly. In 1981, he launched the Bloomberg Terminal, a machine that would become the Wall Street Journal's killer. For a subscription price of over $20,000 per year, a trader could get real-time stock quotes, data analysis, and instant news flashes. The Bloomberg, as it became known, was a direct assault on the Journal's core monopoly. At the same time, Reuters, the British-based news agency, was expanding its own financial data services, competing directly with the Dow Jones newswires. The world of financial news was becoming a high-speed, high-tech arms race. The Journal, with its 19th century print model, looked like a horse and buggy in the age of the jet engine. The Bancroft controlled board, it was alleged, simply did not understand the threat. They were amateurs in a game of professionals. They were insulated by their fortress of Class B shares and their steady stream of dividends. They continued to believe that the prestige of the Journal was enough to protect it. Then, in 2000, the bubble burst. The dot-com crash vaporized the tech industry advertising that had been papering over the cracks. This was followed by the 2001 recession and then a profound structural shift in advertising. Companies no longer needed to buy full-page ads in the Journal to reach investors. They could go directly to them online. The Journal's core business model, selling expensive print ads, was collapsing. The numbers became impossible to ignore. Between 2000 and 2007, the Journal's print advertising revenue, the lifeblood of the company, fell by a catastrophic 20%. The company was bleeding money. In 2006, the year before the final crisis, Dow Jones posted a staggering loss of $80 million. Suddenly, the fortress looked like a trap. The family's dividends, the very income that had funded their quiet, invisible lives, were drying up. The stock price, once a blue-chip staple, was stagnant. The company was failing. The family, which had never been taught how to run the business, was now faced with an impossible choice: hold on to their heritage and watch it go bankrupt, or find a savior. Their incompetence, their passivity, and their conservative inertia had made them the perfect target. They were the sleeping kings of a dying kingdom, sitting on one of the most valuable, prestigious, and mismanaged assets in the world. And in New York, a predator who understood their weakness better than they did was watching. He knew the family was divided. He knew they were desperate. And he knew that their fortress, designed to keep enemies out, was now the one thing preventing them from escaping: the $5 billion bomb that ignited a family civil war. In the cold spring of 2007, the Bancroft family was sitting on a dying animal. The Dow Jones Company, the source of their wealth and identity, was bleeding. The $80 million loss posted in 2006 was not an anomaly. It was a death rattle. The structural collapse of print advertising, the family's decades-long failure to innovate, and the relentless assault from Bloomberg and Reuters had done their work. The family's dividend checks, the river of gold that had funded their invisible lives for a century, were shrinking. The fortress of Class B supervoting shares designed to protect them from the world had become a prison, locking them inside a burning building. They were vulnerable, and the predator knew it. The predator was Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch, the Australian-born head of the global behemoth News Corp, was everything the Bancrofts were not. He was not invisible. He was arguably the most visible and controversial media mogul on earth. He was not passive. He was a relentless, hands-on conqueror. He was not a quiet guardian. He was a brawler. His empire was built on a foundation of populist, often lurid, tabloids like The Sun in London and the New York Post. His most powerful creation, Fox News, had fundamentally altered the American political landscape with its aggressive, conservative-leaning commentary. Murdoch was a man who collected trophies. He had bought the Times of London, the newspaper of the British establishment, and broken the unions to secure it. He had built a global satellite empire. He owned a major Hollywood studio. But there was one prize he craved above all others, the one asset that would grant him the one thing his populist empire never could: respectability. He wanted the Wall Street Journal. He wanted the paper of record for American capitalism. He wanted the prestige, the influence, and the power that came with owning the Dow Jones Industrial Average. He had eyed it for years, but the Bancroft fortress had always seemed impenetrable. Now in 2007, he read the balance sheets. He saw the $80 million loss. He saw the shrinking dividends. And he understood with the clarity of a true predator that the family was no longer a united front. They were 35 scattered beneficiaries, terrified of losing their inheritance. The first rumor surfaced in March. Murdoch was sniffing around. The family, in their typical insulated fashion, dismissed it. They had received offers before and had always politely, privately declined. They believed their 64% voting control was a no button they could press at any time. They failed to understand that Murdoch was not coming to negotiate. He was coming to start a war. On April 17, 2007, Murdoch launched his weapon. He did not make a polite phone call to the Dow Jones board. He sent a formal public letter. The offer was not a starting point. It was a finishing move. He offered $5 billion for Dow Jones and Company. The number was so large, so theatrical, that it stunned Wall Street. He was offering $60 per share for a stock that the day before had been trading at around $36. It was a 67% premium. This was not a business proposition. It was a psychological sledgehammer aimed not at the company's professional board, but directly at the 35 heads of the Bancroft family. Murdoch's genius was in the price. It was deliberately, absurdly high. It was a crazy price, a price so far above the company's actual failing valuation that no other media company in the world, not Bloomberg, not Thomson, not the Washington Post Company, could or would match it. He had instantly cornered the market, and he had instantly shattered the Bancroft family. The $5 billion offer was a loyalty test, and it forced an immediate, brutal civil war. The family's 105 years of quiet, unified passivity evaporated in a single afternoon. Decades of buried resentments, differing financial situations, and personal jealousies exploded into the open. The family, which had never been able to agree on a digital strategy, was now forced to agree on a single $5 billion question. Are we a family defined by our legacy, or are we a collection of individuals who want to be rich? Within days, 3 distinct factions had formed. The first faction was the Defenders. This group was led by Leslie Hill, a family member who served on the Dow Jones board. She was joined by her relative Christopher Bancroft. To them, this was not a financial decision. It was a moral one. They were the guardians of the flame, the true believers in the sacred trust of Clarence Barron. They argued that the Wall Street Journal's integrity was the inheritance. Its independence, its fearless reporting, its character was the entire point. They viewed Rupert Murdoch as the literal antichrist of their values. This was the man of Fox News, of the New York Post's Page 6, of topless women in the sun. They believed with religious fervor that he would destroy the journal's credibility. He would turn its news pages into a political mouthpiece for his conservative agenda and his business interests. As Leslie Hill would later state, selling to Murdoch would be a catastrophic and irreparable blow to the paper. Their stance was simple: no, not at any price. The second faction was the sellers. This group was centered around the Boston-based branches and was immediately personified by the very descendant who had come to embody the family's worst traits, a cousin named Elizabeth Goth Chelberg. Living in her $10 million home in Santa Barbara, Goth Chelberg now became the public face of the faction demanding a sale. She was the living proof of the fatal disconnect that had been festering for generations. The anonymous symbol of incompetence from the past had just stepped into the spotlight, leading the charge to liquidate the family's legacy for cash. To them, the defenders were naive, sentimental children. The legacy they were defending was a company that was losing $80 million a year. The stock was stagnant. Their dividends were shrinking. They were not guardians. They were shareholders. And as shareholders, they had a fiduciary duty and a personal desire to accept a miracle. Murdoch's 67% premium wasn't an offer. It was a rescue. It was a lifeboat. This was their one and perhaps last chance to liquidate their failing inheritance and transform it into billions in liquid generational wealth. They saw the defenders not as noble but as reckless, willing to drive the family into bankruptcy out of pure, childish sentimentality. The third faction was the neutrals, or the agonizers. This group, largely centered on the family's Denver-based branch, was the swing vote, and they were tortured. They believed in the legacy. They despised Murdoch's brand of journalism. They felt the shame of the newsroom's protests, but they also read the balance sheets. They knew the defenders had no alternate plan. The company was dying. Saying no to $5 billion was not a vote for integrity. It was a vote for a slower, more painful death. They were the pragmatists, trapped between the ideologues and the opportunists. Their decision would ultimately seal the company's fate. The war began immediately. The family's most cherished value, invisibility, was the first casualty. They were now the stars of a public soap opera. Their dirty laundry aired in the pages of their rivals. The defenders fired the first shot. Leslie Hill, in a move of open defiance against her own family, dramatically resigned from the Dow Jones board in June 2007. She released a public letter stating she could not, as a director, endorse a sale that she believed would irrevocably harm the journal. It was an act of principled self-destruction designed to shame the sellers. This offer triggered an explosion within the Wall Street Journal itself. For decades, the newsroom had operated with a quiet understanding. The Bancrofts were the absentee landlords. They were invisible, often cheap, and largely useless, but they had one redeeming virtue. They were harmless. The real family, the people who actually showed up to work every day to uphold Clarence Barron's mission, were the journalists. They were the true guardians of the legacy. Now, they were horrified. The sense of betrayal was visceral. They suddenly realized they weren't just employees. They were assets being liquidated by a family that cared nothing for the institution. This wasn't a financial transaction. It was an abdication. Journalists staged public protests, holding signs that shamed their own owners. They organized a frantic last-ditch campaign, sending desperate, pleading letters directly to the 35 scattered family members. This was not a plea from employees to a boss. It was a plea from children begging their parents not to sell the family home to a man they knew would burn it to the ground. They warned that the paper's sacred independence, its very character, would be destroyed under Murdoch. This public outcry wasn't just noise. It was a moral crisis, putting immense pressure on the wavering Denver branch of the family. The sellers fought back in the shadows. They leaked stories to the press. painting the defenders as unrealistic hobbyists. They ridiculed Leslie Hill's holier-than-thou stance. The most brutal attacks were reserved for Elizabeth Goth Chelberg. The defenders' camp, in turn, leaked stories portraying her as a ditz, a party girl who was unqualified to make a decision of this magnitude, an alcoholic who was only interested in the money. The New Yorker and Vanity Fair published devastating profiles of the dysfunctional, incompetent, and divided family. The world's most discreet dynasty was being publicly humiliated, and it was their own family members holding the knives. Behind the scenes, the defenders scrambled for an alternative. Christopher Bancroft was authorized by the family trust to spend $1 million in trust money to hire advisors. His mission: find a white knight. Find anyone else to buy the company. It was a futile, humiliating search. Bancroft approached Michael Bloomberg, who was the most logical choice. Bloomberg took a look and refused. He was building his own empire, not buying a declining one. He approached Thomson, the Canadian media giant. They also passed. He reportedly even reached out to Warren Buffett. No one was interested. And even if they were, no one would match Murdoch's $60 per share crazy price. Murdoch's strategy had been flawless. He had isolated the Bancrofts, offering a price so high that it was indefensible for the company's board not to accept it, and simultaneously ensuring no competitor would step in. The White Knight was not coming. The family was alone, trapped with their predator. The final act was a masterpiece of corporate theater. To soothe the agonizing Denver branch and give the sellers the public relations cover they needed, Murdoch offered a concession. He agreed to the formation of a 5-member special committee that would have the power to approve the hiring or firing of the journal's top editors. This, he claimed, would guarantee the paper's journalistic independence. The defenders sought for exactly what it was, a meaningless fig leaf. The committee was a farce, a polite fiction, but it was the excuse the wavering family members needed. It allowed them to tell the world and themselves that they had protected the journal's integrity while they walked away with the $5 billion. The final agonizing decision fell to the Denver branch. They had held out for months, but the lack of a white knight, the grim financial reports, and the sheer crushing weight of Murdoch's offer finally broke them. They concluded that saying no was the greater risk. The company was dying on their watch. Murdoch was the only lifeboat. On August 1st, 2007, the family trusts held their final vote. The defenders, led by Hill and Christopher Bancroft, held a significant portion, but they did not have the 33% needed to block the sale. The sellers, led by Goth Chelberg, and the newly convinced Denver branch, combined their shares. The family voted to approve the sale. The war was over. Murdoch had won. The public fighting, the leaks, and the clear conflicts of interest on the board were so severe that the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, launched an investigation. But in 2007, the SEC quietly concluded its probe without filing any charges. The truth was, what the Bancrofts had done was not technically illegal. It was just a spectacular, generational failure of stewardship. 105 years of control, dating back to Clarence Barron, was ended in a single vote. The Wall Street Journal newsroom was described as a morgue. The journalists were in mourning. The Bancroft family, $5 billion richer, was shattered. Their name, once synonymous with the quiet stewardship of the world's greatest newspaper, was now a byword for abdication. It was the final, inevitable price of an accidental dynasty built on passivity. The $2 billion prize that only bought shame and lawsuits. When Rupert Murdoch's $5 billion wire transfer hit the Bancroft family trusts, it was the sound of an explosion. The money, which was meant to be the family's final reward, became a solvent, dissolving the last remaining bonds that held the dynasty together. The 105-year-old facade of quiet, unified Boston Brahmin stewardship shattered, revealing the bitter resentments, generational anger, and profound sense of loss that had been papered over by the sale. The Bancrofts, now stripped of their one unifying asset, ceased to be a dynasty. They became 35 extraordinarily wealthy, atomized individuals, haunted by the public humiliation of their abdication. The infighting did not end with the sale, it metastasized. The war that had been fought in the pages of the New Yorker and Vanity Fair now moved into the court system. The $2 billion in after-tax proceeds was a massive pie to divide, and the family immediately began to fight over the crumbs. In 2008, a bitter lawsuit erupted in Massachusetts. The younger generation, furious at their elders, challenged the distribution of the assets. They argued that the trustees, the very fiduciaries who had failed to protect the company, were now also mismanaging the final payout. The courts ultimately dismissed the claims, but the legal battle was a public and pathetic coda to the family's reign. It was the final ugly squabble over the spoils of a kingdom they had allowed to be conquered. The most profound rift was generational. The younger members of the family, like Crawford Hill, a fourth-generation descendant, were vocal in their contempt. They had grown up with the idea of the journal, if not the responsibility for it. They saw the sale as a brazen theft of their birthright. They accused their parents' generation of selling out a sacred 105-year-old trust for a vulgar pile of cash. This younger generation felt a sense of shame that the older seller faction seemed incapable of. They were the ones who would have to live with the name Bancroft, a name that was no longer synonymous with journalistic integrity, but with incompetence and betrayal. Some members of this generation reportedly stopped using the Bancroft name entirely, seeking to build new lives free from the stigma. The public humiliation was perhaps worse than the financial infighting. For a century, the family's most prized possession, even more than the journal itself, was its invisibility. They had cultivated an aura of mystery, of quiet, old money dignity. That was gone forever. The 2007 sale had thrust them into the global spotlight as the most compelling corporate drama of the decade, and they had been cast as the villains, or even worse, the fools. The press, led by the very journalistic institutions they once saw as their peers, was merciless. Vanity Fair and The New Yorker had published devastating, deeply sourced portraits of the family during the sale. They were portrayed as dysfunctional, spoiled, and hopelessly naive. They were the feckless heirs, the trust fund babies who had fumbled their inheritance. They were the sleeping kings who had let a fox into the henhouse. This narrative of the bumbling, incompetent rich was irresistible, and it stuck. The Bancroft name was now a punchline, a case study taught in business schools on how not to manage a family enterprise. In the face of this global ridicule, the family had no response. There was no patriarch or matriarch to rally them. The strong leaders of the past, like Clarence Barron or even Hugh Bancroft Jr., were long gone. The family had no designated leader, no public face, no one to defend their honor or explain their decision. They had spent a century learning how to be invisible, and when the spotlight finally found them, they had no idea how to behave. They simply took the money and scattered, retreating back to their private enclaves in Boston, Denver, and Santa Barbara, leaving the public narrative to be written by their critics. The only flicker of the family's former identity came from the Defender faction, but it was a quiet, private gesture. The branch of the family, led by Leslie Hill, the director who had resigned in protest, used their share of the Murdoch payout to fund philanthropic causes. They quietly established foundations and donated an estimated $10 million to causes they believed in: education, environmentalism, and, in a final tragic irony, the very journalistic integrity they had failed to protect. But these were private acts of atonement, not a public relations campaign. They did nothing to restore the family's shattered reputation. The final insult was the fate of the journal itself. The family's worst fears were, in the eyes of many, immediately realized. Murdoch was not a passive owner. He installed his own people, most notably the aggressive British editor Robert Thomson. The paper underwent a seismic shift. While its core financial reporting remained largely respected, the paper's focus broadened, chasing the more general political and cultural territory of its great rival, the New York Times. The sacred wall between the news pages and the famously conservative editorial page, critics argued, began to blur. The paper's tone became more populist, more aligned with the Murdoch worldview. For the journalists in the newsroom, the Bancroft era was suddenly looked back on with a strange, bitter nostalgia. The family had been incompetent, absent, and cheap, but they had also been harmless. They had, in their own passive way, honored Clarence Barron's one great commandment. They left the newsroom alone. They had created a sanctuary, and now that sanctuary was gone. The journalists had traded their bumbling, invisible landlords for one of the most demanding and interventionist media owners in the world. The disintegration of the Bancroft name was complete. It was a dynasty that died not from poverty, but from wealth. It was undone by the very structures created to protect it. The trusts that guaranteed their income also guaranteed their incompetence. The invisibility that protected their privacy also made them naive. And the inheritance that was meant to secure their future instead became the weapon that destroyed their past. Were they villains or just terrible at business? The sale of the Wall Street Journal was not just a business transaction. It was a seismic event in the American power structure, a moment so profound it immediately spawned a dark mythology. For media critics, academics, and a shell-shocked public, the $5 billion deal was too simple. The idea that a 105-year-old dynasty would simply fold, that a family defined by its integrity would hand its greatest asset to its ideological opposite, felt incomplete. It felt like a cover story. And so, in the absence of a rational explanation, dark speculation began to bloom. The most potent and persistent of this speculation was that the Bancrofts had not just sold a company, they had sold their soul. This was the narrative that took root in media blogs and academic forums in the months following the 2007 sale. It alleged that the sale was not a surrender, but a deliberate, coordinated betrayal. The Bancrofts, this theory went, were not incompetent fools. They were willing participants in a plot by Rupert Murdoch to consolidate his control over American public opinion. The family was accused of being the final crucial domino in Murdoch's plan to control the entire spectrum of American discourse, from the populist, right-leaning megaphone of Fox News to the elite, establishment voice of the Wall Street Journal. This narrative was deeply appealing because it offered a villain. It was easier to believe the Bancrofts were evil than to accept they were simply weak. This theory painted the $5 billion payout not as a golden parachute, but as a bribe. It was the price for the soul of the American press. This grand conspiracy theory was bolstered by smaller, more specific rumors. The most venomous of these, which circulated widely in media circles, was that Murdoch had paid secret, off-the-books money to the seller faction of the family, specifically the Boston-based branch. The $60 per share offer, the rumor went, was just the public price. To get the greedy, wavering cousins across the finish line, Murdoch had supposedly arranged for additional private kickbacks. This rumor, it must be stated, has never been substantiated. No evidence, no whistleblower, and no paper trail has ever emerged to prove its authenticity. But its existence was crucial. It provided a motive that made sense to critics. The Bancrofts who voted yes didn't just get a premium. They got a secret, dirty payout that sealed the conspiracy. The reality, however, was both simpler and in many ways more damning. There was no grand conspiracy. There was no secret plot. The truth, as documented by the reporters who covered the collapse, was that the family was not unified enough to orchestrate a conspiracy, even if it had wanted to. The sale was not a complex plan. It was a stampede, an act of sheer uncoordinated panic driven by incompetence, greed, and a very real, very rational fear of bankruptcy. But to dismiss these dark rumors is not to dismiss the family's influence. Before 2007, the Bancroft dynasty wielded an immense and often unexamined soft power. They did not, as Murdoch would, use the journal as a political weapon. They did not have to. The Wall Street Journal, by its very nature, was one of the most powerful propaganda tools for a specific worldview: American free market capitalism. For a century, the journal's news and, most explicitly, its editorial pages had been the high doctrine of the capitalist faith. It championed deregulation, free trade, and supply-side economics. Its influence was not felt in the crass day-to-day spin of a political election, but in the deep, structural, decades-long consensus it built within the halls of power. It was the paper read by every CEO, every Federal Reserve chairman, every president, and every senator. It set the terms of the economic debate for the entire country. The Bancrofts, as the silent owners of this institution, were the invisible high priests of this faith. Their power was so total, so embedded in the establishment, that they never had to exercise it. It simply was. The 2007 sale, therefore, was not the creation of a media monopoly, but the transfer of one. And the transfer was to a man who had no interest in soft power. Rupert Murdoch was a man who understood and wielded hard political power. The fear was that he would take the journal's institutional credibility and merge it with the populist, brawling tactics of Fox News. In the years after the sale, the reality proved to be more complex. Murdoch did undeniably consolidate his power. He now owned the paper of the elite, Wall Street Journal, the paper of the populists, Fox News, and the paper of the establishment in the UK, the Times of London. It was a terrifying concentration of media influence. He immediately poured money into the journal, expanding its scope, launching a glossy lifestyle magazine, and aggressively challenging the New York Times on its own political and cultural turf. But the central fear that he would gut the newsroom and turn it into a right-wing echo chamber did not fully materialize. The journal's core financial and investigative reporting remained remarkably robust. The sacred wall between the famously conservative editorial page, which Murdoch left largely untouched, and the independent newsroom, while stressed, did not entirely collapse. A 2010 analysis by the Nieman Journalism Lab at Harvard noted that while the paper's direction had clearly shifted, the worst fears of a total Foxification had not come to pass. The journal's newsroom, populated by journalists who saw themselves as the true guardians of the legacy, had proven more resilient than expected. The final verdict on the Bancroft dynasty, then, is not one of conspiracy. It is a story of negligence. The family's legacy is not a secret plot, but a brutal and public lesson in the failures of generational stewardship. The experts who have studied the case, like the late media critic Ben Bagdikian, whose work The New Media Monopoly warned of the dangers of concentrated ownership, saw the Bancroft sale as a textbook example of a trend. The problem was not just Murdoch. The problem was a system that allowed the most sacred assets of a democracy, its free press, to be bought and sold like any other commodity. The Bancrofts were not conspirators. They were simply the last weak link in a chain. They were the generation that held the keys to the kingdom when the digital revolution arrived. They were the ones who faced the profound structural market pressures of digitalization, a force that was killing their print-based model. They were offered an impossible choice: go bankrupt protecting a principle, or become fabulously wealthy by surrendering it. They chose the money. Their story is a permanent cautionary tale. It is a lesson in the profound difference between inheritance and competence. It demonstrates the tragic frailty of family governance when faced with a ruthless professional predator. And it serves as the final ignominious epitaph for a dynasty that died not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet, sterile, and extraordinarily lucrative vote of abdication.